Tonight, Dr. David Fenner is presenting Afghanistan, the Graveyard of Empires. Dr. Fenner is an affiliate faculty member at the UW's Jackson School of International Studies. That's a very famous school, by the way. In the spring quarter of 2022, he taught the Middle East refugee crisis, local and global responses. He is also the lead presenter for the federally funded Bridging Cultures project, which offers professional development workshops for K-12 teachers and first responders in communities with growing populations of immigrants. In the late 1970s, Dr. Fenner and his wife spent 3 years in the Sultanate of Oman as Peace Corps volunteers. In 2007, they returned to the Arabian Peninsula to found an educational center for Arab and Western students that is designed to explore all of these things: language, history, faith, natural resources, and diplomacy. There are more chairs. We can put more chairs in the back there. There are more chairs right now in the back. And so you might be able to get a better view. In this session, we are going to explore the long and contentious history of Afghanistan, from the conquest of Alexander the Great to today's tragic headlines. For those of you on Zoom, please ask any questions you have by putting them in the chat box. This program is being recorded, and there will be a resource list provided on our website. Please welcome Dr. David Fenner.
Jill, thank you. And I'm delighted to be here. I now live just down on the sort of bridge side of Tacoma, so it was a pleasure to drive that way rather than to come from Seattle. And so in my retirement, I am in your neighborhood, and most importantly, even though you're all special, in the neighborhood of my grandchildren. So so that's really what makes me so available. I also want to thank you for the invitation, Jill, for your kind outreach to me, and for taking the time and the effort to be here. The whole philosophy, I think, of the Enlightened program is you got to keep learning. And it sounds to me like, from this range of topics that you have explored over the months, at least the ones I could find on the website, that you are in fact full of curiosity and inquisitiveness. And that makes it the job of any instructor really easy if you are keen to learn something. I had a speech and debate coach in high school who taught me several things, and one of them was the importance of enunciation. So if you have at any point difficulty in understanding a word or a phrase, just call out and say, what? Yeah, so I will try to enunciate better. We also are going to have an opportunity for pronunciation, because you're going to repeat after me a little bit of Pashto, a little bit of Arabic, and a little bit of Persian. Yeah, well, you didn't know you were going to get this, but you are. In order to make that happen, it's designed to be an activity sort of toward the start of our 45 minutes or so before we get to the Q&A. But its real mission is to loosen your tongues so that when you do get to the Q&A period at the end, your hands will involuntarily go up with that question that you had been wanting to ask. So if you hadn't gotten started with a little Pashto or Arabic or Persian, you would just be sitting there, and then you'd go home and you'd say, I wished I'd asked him what in the world about this or that aspect of Afghanistan. We're going to cover an awful lot of territory, and we're going to do it pretty rapidly because we don't have all all week and all weekend together. But much of it is an attempt really that many observers of Afghanistan try to develop, and that is a context for the country, a sense of its history, how it got to be what it is today, and to see whether or not there are any historical antecedents that are sort of threads that you can actually identify in the year 2023. So that's our mission, is to do that with a country that is oft discussed, but little understood. So let's go. I started with this picture of Afghanistan. It is apparently, although I have not been there, it is apparently an absolutely fabulously beautiful country in many ways, with towering peaks and very fertile high valleys, and lots of rivers that are rushing torrents in the spring and early summer. But I also wanted to remind us, if reminding is needed, that the postcard-like vision of this slide is marred by the sad reality of the fact that since 1979, and for many centuries before that, Afghanistan has been the source of the location of a tremendous amount of conflict. And so, as we know from our own last 20 years of US history, that there has been a great deal of war and conflict in Afghanistan, but that it unfortunately goes even farther back from that. And another image I wanted to start you off with is this one, because we all also witnessed a year and a half ago how the Taliban took over Kabul, took over the rest of the country almost without firing a shot in August of that year. And it is an extraordinary geopolitical and political development in the communities of nations that you would have that rapid and that radical a change in so short a period of time without firing a shot. Plenty of shots had been fired, of course, in the last 20 years and 40 years and 50 years. So our impossible roadmap today, it's going to be a little bit of a bumpy roadmap, but it's to thank you for being here. Thank you for being inquisitive. We're going to do some pronunciation, as I said. We're going to talk quite a bit about empire. And I am afraid that many of us, almost all of us, in fact, undervalue the significance of the imperial period of human experience. For the vast majority of our time as social beings, we have been a part of somebody's empire rather than in control of our own destiny, our own country, our own nation. And so we're going to look a little bit at how that has impacted Afghanistan. There's an old Swahili saying, the language of East Africa, that when the elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. And it could very well be that that is too true of the all of those mountains and valleys in Afghanistan. We'll look with some specifics at the Soviet invasion in 1979. Lots was happening in 1979, and I was in the Middle East living at the time, as Jill mentioned, and it was a time that was fraught. You may also remember that it was the time when the Islamic Revolution in Iran happened, and that our embassy personnel were taken hostage that year and held for 444 days. Taliban had a chance to take control of the country after a civil war in the 1990s and ruled for about 5 years. And it was pretty much disastrous for everybody concerned. It wasn't the Russians running the show, and it wasn't yet the Americans or NATO running the show. So at least it was Afghans in control of their country, but they were brutal and they were intolerant and they were, in the end, unable to hold on to power when after 9/11, the United States and its NATO allies invaded and occupied their country. That was a big, as you all know, and we all remember, it was a watershed moment, and it's hard to think back about how significantly emotional it was for all of us that we watched those buildings in New York City and at the Pentagon attacked by religious zealots. In addition to looking at the geopolitics of things, though, and trying to understand the foreign policy implications, we're also going to try to make this more of a human experience and look actually at some of the refugees who have fled Afghanistan, particularly since the Taliban, the most recent Taliban takeover, many of whom are coming to Washington State. Question that lots of people ask, particularly in the news media, is this Taliban regime any better or worse than the last one? The last one being awful. Is this one apt to be any better? Have they learned something about ruling that country? And then we're going to look not at their lessons learned, but at our lessons learned. What was it that we probably should take away from our experience in Afghanistan and apply that understanding, that knowledge, those new insights into what we do next geopolitically. We'll get to your all-important Q&A, and then I had to pick a good, knowing that I was the venue that we were in, I had to pick a good benediction, of course, from the Latin good word. So I'm going to leave us with a good word at the end that hopefully is uplifting. I think you'll agree that the source of the benediction will be uplifting when you see him. One thing that we're going to also do, as I mentioned, is work on pronunciation. And it's been a mission of mine since we got back from the Middle East that to help my fellow and sister Americans pronounce these two words. These are two-syllable words, and most Americans mispronounce all four of these syllables. So if you would pronounce these words after me, I'm going to do Iraq first on the left there. And we all know these sounds. These aren't foreign sounds. So if you would repeat after me, rock. And now put the accent, the emphasis on the rock. Iraq. Iraq. Okay, good, good. You've got it. Now, just as easy as this one. Iran. Iran. It's just it's music to my ears that you are doing that. Now, I have tried to teach students and community members how to pronounce these two country names for a long time. And usually your newfound skill in that lasts about 38 minutes. And then in the Q&A, when your hand goes involuntarily up, you say, well, what about Iraq? And then I get the whole group again to say Iran. So if you hear anybody tonight saying Iran, don't let them. Just help me to improve all of us. Aha. And now some Pashto. So the language of the largest minority group in Afghanistan is an Indo-European language. But these two words are also most of the time mispronounced, particularly by our political leaders. So if you would repeat after me, Taliban, Taliban, Taliban. You got it. And then Kabul, Kabul. It's not Kabul, for goodness sakes. It's Kabul. Okay. Now, if you learn nothing else tonight, I will have accomplished my mission. talk about what Afghanistan is in some data specifics for just a minute or two before we look at history and trends and the Taliban themselves. About 35 million people, but nobody is around to count them these days. We don't know exactly what the numbers are. In 1979, when the Soviets first invaded Afghanistan, 4 million people left the country, almost all of whom stayed in Iran right next door. So it's a little unclear exactly how many people are there and how many people have left. It's also landlocked, and you'll see why when we figure out why Afghanistan as a country became the territory that it is. And you won't be surprised to know that empire has a finger in all of that. You'll see a chart in a few minutes about the vast preponderance of young people in Afghanistan today. More than 72 or 73% are under 30. So that means almost everybody is kids and teenagers and young adults. They have a lot of ethnic diversity that we may not fully appreciate from afar. The Pashtuns, as I mentioned, are the largest of those ethnic groups, but there are Tajiks, there are Uzbeks, there are Hazara people, and people that may have emigrated into this territory 100, 400, 1,000 years ago. So they have as much of a set of roots in Afghanistan as people who might have come much more recently. The country itself is vastly rural, 80-20, rural population to urban dwellers, and it's very conservative. Always has been, always maybe will be. And part of that conservative approach to life is a very patriarchal attitude. It is that place where the men run the show. Talked about the Pashtuns. Mountainous terrain, the average altitude in Afghanistan, average altitude countrywide is 10,000 feet. Yeah, think about that. The Soviets did not think about that, by the way, because their M124 helicopters couldn't fly very well at those altitudes, and that was to their detriment. They've been fighting somebody occupying their territory since the flood, since time began. There's always been somebody who wants to control this territory. And it's just absolutely perfectly suited for the growing of opium poppies. And so it is and has been, even under American occupation, the #1 cash crop in Afghanistan. Languages are important to understand the different ethnicities that go along with them. And as you can see, the Pashtuns down at the bottom there, and we're going to talk quite a bit about this southeastern border of Afghanistan, but just look at the range of languages that are spoken throughout the country. Here's that chart to talk about the age breakdown. 47% under 15, another 27% under 29. And so you end up with this absolute youth bubble that any country around the world would have a hard time incorporating into their economy, into their society, because there are simply so many of them. A couple of other teaching moments here. Afghan or Afghan in Pashto, but Afghan is a person and Afghani is the currency. So we often wonder whether or not there's a good adjectival form of Afghan, and it's Afghan. So there's an Afghan novel that we'll talk about later, but I spent 10 Afghani buying it, okay? Mujahideen is a word that we all know from our own experiences in helping to recruit and support and fund and train a group of people to go back into Afghanistan or to go there for the first time when the Soviets were occupying that territory in the 1980s. The mujahideen is the plural of the word jihadist in Arabic. And then Taliban, which you've already learned how to say, is that very conservative Islamist group who believe that if it didn't happen in the 7th century, the century that the Quran was revealed to Muhammad, the prophet, then they don't want anything to do with it. And there's a real core of the Taliban that try to live as if it's still the 7th century. There is another group within the Taliban that are using social media and all the modern mod cons, we used to call them, modern conveniences of the 21st century. But there is a group, many of whom are in control of the country, who don't want anything to do with the modern world. Okay, let's take a short course. The first important confession is that we Americans do an awful job of trying to understand Afghanistan. I come from a large research institution not far from here, and we have a Middle East Center where I have worked for years, and nobody in the Middle East Center covers Afghanistan. We have a South Asian Center, and nobody in the South Asian Center covers Afghanistan. And we have a Russian, East European, and Central Asian Center, and nobody looks at Afghanistan. And so if you're if you're anything like the University of Washington, all around the country, there are about 6 Americans who working in research institutions who are working on Afghanistan. It's so much of a vacuum in our understanding, in our scholarship. And the University of Washington is just as guilty as that. So some of us in the Middle East Center said, let's just sort of push the envelope a little bit into somebody else's territory and start to talk about, do research on, and if we can, engage Afghans and about their country. And nobody resisted that. So it was sort of a terra nova where we could go academically and try to develop some level of understanding. You all get to be a part of that. But perhaps you can read this. I'll read it, but it's a political cartoon that came out during our occupation of Afghanistan. And each of these tombstones is Persia, the Mongols, Great Britain, the USSR, and then Admiral Mullen is saying, oh, I'm in. I can live with all of them. And so he's just sort of following in a long line of invaders who have tried to control this territory. It leads me to that sort of conclusion that I shared at the beginning, that is that there are some distinct historical periods, particularly as you look at the Middle East. There was a part when all of these countries were part of somebody's empire, the British, the Ottomans, the Abbasid, the French at some point, and all of them developed in unique ways because of that imperial past. Following the imperial period, when the empire power was actually in control, many of the empires for this territory receded their immediate control, but continued to, in some cases, literally mine the resources of those places as colonies. We used to be 13 colonies when a very large empire was doing exactly the same thing with us. Much more recently, the nation state starts to develop around the world, and it's a kind of almost a 19th century phenomenon when individual countries start bubbling up and saying, well, hold it, we Austrians, we're a distinct people. We have a semi-distinct language from the people next door. We should be our own country. And that has happened, as we know, all around the planet for the last, particularly in the post-war World War II era. In 1945, there were 57 nations in the world. Today, there are 194. So think about how all of those empires broke off into smaller pieces and became places like Romania and Bulgaria and Poland and the Czech Republic. One sad note about this particular part of the world is, though, that those developing states that were finally getting their independence from the imperial powers and trying to make a go of it as the people in charge of their own destiny, almost every one of them in the Middle East became a dictatorship of some kind or another. And so they went from this development state to a security state where the main goal was keeping Bashar al-Assad or Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi in charge. What that led to in all of those cases was development state to security state to failed state.
Recording in progress.
Oh, good. That imperial period lasted a long time. And as you can see, started a long time ago in our recorded history. Thank you, Alexander the Great, for that. But as you all remember from your history books, he swept out of Macedonia in the northern part of what is today Greece and southern part of the former Yugoslavia, and for years and years conquered territory to the east and south of him. And so Alexander the Great's empire was massive and included nearly all of what is today Afghanistan, leaving behind an extraordinary number. I think 70 is the number that some historians bandy about. He named 70 different cities Alexandria. And there's some of them that name stuck. The one in northern Egypt right here that we all know as Alexandria was just one of those 70. But you know the name of the city that was given that name in Afghanistan. Al-Iskandar. Al-Iskandar. Kandahar is Alexandria in Pashto. Thanks to Alexander the Great. He sweeps across the known world, pushes the Persians into a very tiny corner of their former empire, turns around and tries to make it home. And as you also know, he doesn't survive the trip home. So what he did manage to leave behind was a bunch of his Greek generals who then set up shop and started to run this part of Central Asia and the Middle East, Far East, Middle East, as its own new kingdom. And it is known to historians as the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, but it was the legacy of Alexander the Great's conquest that is there. It didn't stop with those empires. Everybody wanted a piece of the action. The Umayyad and Abbasid empires were both Islamic empires. The Mongols in the 13th century sweep out of the east and conquer everybody, all the way up to the gates of Vienna. The Safavids were Persians, whose, after Alexander the Great's empire started to shrink again, the Persians were reborn as a power. And then the Mughal Empire in India was another one that was very interested in controlling that territory. Those were all significant, long-lasting empires that had a tremendous amount of impact on Afghanistan. They may not have experienced it as the graveyard of empires, but many of them left a legacy of how to do things. And many of them also left their DNA in that territory. Okay, here's your first quiz. This map is of the planet, landmass on the planet Earth. And what do we think the white areas on this map represent? Any guesses?
Mountains.
Mountains, a good guess, Jill? Huh?
Landlocked?
Landlocked, not all, but maybe that has something to do with the answer here. What else?
Are they colonies?
No.
But the only area that Alexander the Christian doesn't show up.
Almost. You'll be surprised how close that is as an answer. The white areas depict the only parts of the world never invaded by England. Think empire. And I don't think we walk around with the knowledge that in fact is how over the last several hundred years, the British and the English had so much influence over the rest of the world. Particularly in the 19th century, when, as you know, the British Empire was at its height. The sun never set on the British Empire. The Royal Navy was in charge of the 7 seas. And there were some other empires that were growing at that time. Certainly one of them was the Russian Empire under the Romanov Tsar dynasty. And the Russians and the British were always jockeying for prominence, position, territory, influence, raw materials, resources, and they clashed wherever they clashed. And you probably know this already. But one of the reasons that that Napoleon invaded Russia was that Russia refused to embargo Britain. Think about that. So Napoleon's trying to weaken Britain by getting the Russians to stop trading with them, and the Russians don't do it even though they say they are. But the Russian Empire, as you know, particularly after Peter the Great, grew into this massive 1/7 of the world's landmass, but it comes into contact and conflict with the British Empire, particularly in South Asia. So if you look at this map closely enough, you start to see that here is British India up to this point, and almost all of the territory up there, I know I'm on Zoom and I'm off camera, is the Russian Empire, and they're constantly struggling with the other for territory and influence. Here's another better map of it. Certainly the Qing dynasty in China was also a part of this set of developments, but particularly Russia and the British are in this contentious relationship. And so together, they decide that what they need is a buffer zone. And so together, the British and the Russians create out of whole cloth Afghanistan. That yellow object in the middle is Afghanistan. From the late 19th century, this political cartoon of an Afghan standing between the Russian bear and the British lion, and the caption says, in sort of blurry font, "Save me from my friends." You can get a sense of how British India goes right up to what is today Afghanistan and then stops. And there's a historical reason for that. Another good look at Afghanistan perched between Russia and Great Britain. And I think the next slide is a telling thing that may be the only other thing you should take away tonight, if you only remember 3 or 4 or 5 things. This is what we thought Afghanistan looks like. And in fact, this is what it looks like. 75, 78 different little kingdoms, little fiefdoms, little warlord-controlled valleys where they don't have much truck with anybody over the top of those tall mountains and in the next valley. But we've always treated Afghanistan like it's this, when it's really not this. We aren't the only ones. The British fought 3 wars in Afghanistan, trying to control that territory, and lost every one of them. This is significant for a couple of reasons. One of them is that, remember, the British are the preeminent power in the world at this point in the 19th century, and yet they have lost 3 wars against the Afghans. In one of them, the British Army was trying to get from Kabul to Jalalabad with 4,000 men and 14,000 retainers. And in 1841, this whole large group of British soldiers and their retainers starts in Kabul and tries to get to Jalalabad, having extracted from the king of Afghanistan a promise that they would have safe passage. And these 18,000 people left Kabul, and a total number of 1 arrived. This was a massive disaster in the British press, in the British psyche, in the British Imperium. And we even know the name of this one who managed to survive this very short passage. Kabul to Jalalabad is Seattle to Portland. So the British, after that, and after fighting those 3 wars, have had enough of Afghanistan, and they empower their envoy to Afghanistan, a man named Mortimer Durand, to come up with a border beyond which the British can say, we don't care what happens over there. We're only going to defend British India right up to this point. And at that point, the Russians agreed to that. And this border came to be known as the Durand Line after Mortimer Durand. And the British drew it on the map, and not really fully thinking about what was it drawing a line through the middle of. Well, it turns out they were drawing a line through the middle of the Pashtuns' traditional territory. And so today, as we speak, half of the world's Pashtuns live in Afghanistan, and their cousins live in Pakistan. So if you've ever wondered, that Durand Line, in fact, became the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. If you've ever wondered why this border so bedeviled virtually everybody, it's because they were there, just this natural flow of people back and forth across it was the result of a really bad bit of cartography. It brings us to Bob Dylan, of course, because everything brings you to Bob Dylan eventually. But in one of his songs, he has a line that says, "The line it is drawn, and the curse it is cast." And I think that it probably describes that Afghan-Pakistan border better than any long-winded professor from the UW, particularly since this is what the border looks like. And if you're thinking about how you're going to fortify this, this is the line that separates Afghanistan and Pakistan. We're going to speed up a little bit because I'm watching somebody has turned the clock really fast ahead, but forgive me if I keep you a little long. The result of all of this is, to my mind, the seed sowing of one of the sets of reasons why Afghanistan has so many problems today. And one of the savviest of observers of Afghanistan and other developing nations talks about how a Lebanese guy, in fact, talks about how nations need to, in order to develop naturally and organically, they need to have control over some things, like they need to be able to define what nationhood and statehood mean to them. They need to create the kind of governmental structure that they want. They need to define what roles and rights of the citizen, the responsibilities of the state, the limitations of the state, the domestic policies, the transportation, the communication, the commerce, the judiciary, the foreign policies of that state and whom they should have alliances with, The leadership, how do we replace the king or the prime minister or the president? And in a word, they need to have had the opportunity to develop their own legitimacy. And Afghanistan, sadly, is a poster child for the fact that they didn't have an opportunity to do any of those things. They were the pawns of empire. Fast forwarding. 1979, the Soviets decide that they need to control that territory, so they, under Brezhnev, send in 115,000 men and women to fight in Afghanistan, and are there for 10 years, may have killed as many as 2 million Afghans, sowed the country with tens of millions of landmines, and wondered in the Soviet press. I, in fact, was in the Soviet Union during part of this time. In the Soviet press, they kept wondering why they weren't winning the hearts and minds of the Afghan people. All they needed was one photograph. Brezhnev listened to his generals saying that they could do it. They would be in and out in 3 months. Yeah, that sounds familiar. The Russians go, the Soviets go in to support some left-leaning puppets of theirs who were in trouble because they were left-leaning puppets of the Soviets, and the rest, sadly, is history for a very bleak period. But it's where our history as involvement and in political and military terms, it's where our history gets dragged into this conflict. But I wanted to show you this map in particular. During the Soviet occupation, the Soviet Union never occupied 80% of the country. They only occupied this band that you can see in the dark gray there, around kind of a ring around the major cities. They never even went out into the rest of the territory. I was teaching a class last spring at the UW on campus, and one of my students was a Army officer who was there getting a master's degree in international studies. He was a colonel, and he had done 3 tours in Afghanistan. And he looked at this map and he said, "This looks exactly like our map of our control in Afghanistan." The Soviets invade, and a guy named Zbigniew Brzezinski, that we may remember, is advising President Carter and saying, coming up with this idea that if we get a whole bunch of religious hotheads and train them, fund them, arm them, and send them into Afghanistan, they will make life miserable for the Soviets. And sure enough, that's just what we did. Ronald Reagan, as you know, succeeded Jimmy Carter and brought the Saudis into the picture. And so Ronald Reagan and the United States made an agreement with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan that we would fund, the Saudis in the United States would fund these mujahideen, freedom fighters, and Pakistan would be their launching point and infiltration point across that very porous border. And the Saudis would match our contribution dollar for dollar. So with Saudi money, American know-how and training, and Pakistani's safe haven along that border, the Mujahideen are empowered to go in and make life miserable for the Soviets. And in course, as you all know, included among that group of religious zealots was this guy. And so for the first time in the late 1980s, Osama bin Laden goes to Afghanistan and does the bidding of all of these parties that are trying to push the Soviets out. President Reagan hosted a group of the Mujahideen in the Oval Office, as you can see from this photograph, and then made a comment that will live in history, if not infamy. But he said, the moral equivalent of our founding fathers are these freedom fighters. These Mujahideen are the moral equivalent of our founding fathers. And what President Reagan and President Carter and Zbigniew Brzezinski and everybody in those days didn't quite figure out is that the Mujahideen weren't there to kick the Soviets out. The Mujahideen were there to kick any non-Afghan out, every non-Afghan out, and that they'd been doing it since 2,500 years ago, trying to kick out the invaders. And if you had to put, what's the right word, a coda on the end of our unfortunate experience in Afghanistan, it's that we never really understood that it was going to be a hopeless enterprise, that we were going to not only going to be able to create a Jeffersonian democracy there and liberate women and make sure that there was not a safe haven for terrorism, but we weren't going to be successful because we weren't Afghan. So I'm going to look at the clock. That clock. I wished I hadn't looked at that ever. So we started providing more and more sophisticated weapons to the Mujahideen, as you know from Charlie Wilson's war, pretty accurate actually historically. Among those were Stinger missiles, man-carried portable surface-to-air missiles, and we took down a lot of those helicopters. And the Soviets then, throughout their news media, even started to use the word balota. Let's try that. Balota. Balota. Yeah. Quagmire is what it is. It's also swamp. But interestingly, the Pashtun word for quagmire is dilemma. Dilemma, yeah, dilemma. I mean, this is an Indo-European language. Dilemma is, we get that word from Afghanistan. So 10 years later, the Soviets pull out under Mikhail Gorbachev, sees that it is a no-win situation. Not only are 115,000 Russians killed in this process over that 10-year period, but many, many more times that number come home to the Soviet Union in sad, sad shape. Many of them are addicted to opium, introducing one of the real long-term costs of war for the Soviets. Okay, now I'm going to make a decision about what to do next. So who do you think this is? That's Pandora, right? So after the Soviets get kicked out, what does the United States do? No, they go home. They leave. They go out the door. And they let all hell break loose behind them in this vacuum. The Soviets are gone. The Americans say, oh, we've gotten the Soviets out. We're done. They leave Afghanistan in this position, and then all of the furies come out of Pandora's box, including all of these groups of, many of them religious hotheads, who are then going to try to vie with each other for control of this territory. But if we hadn't just left, things may have turned out differently. So with that, I'm running out of time, but I'm going to fast forward really quickly to what do I? Oh, good. Thanks. To 9/11, because 9/11, of course, even though we've been involved by proxy in Afghanistan, it wasn't until 9/11 that we got involved personally, nationally, individually, overtly militarily. And we started to, after 9/11, it didn't take, it was October 7th, in fact, of that year when we first troops invaded Afghanistan. And as you all know, the war then lasted for 20 more years. But a really important part of our history was that within a year and a half, actually, after the initial American invasion of Afghanistan, the Taliban disappears. They either melt away back into that countryside or they join the new regime in Kabul. And Afghans have been doing that for 2,500 years, where they either just put down their swords or their Stinger missiles and go back to the village, take off their uniforms if they had one on to begin with, or they join the other team. And so there's a long history in Afghanistan of ending conflict by giving up. This absolutely happened in August of 2021, when the United States pulled out and the Taliban came in. The Taliban, the Afghan National Army, simply disappeared. They knew the battle was over because they were so dependent on the Americans. I'm going to motor through these guys only because it's history now. But the United States and the NATO powers positioned two leaders in Afghanistan who were Afghans at least, but they were clearly imposed on the Afghan people by military force. First was Hamid Karzai, the second was Ashraf Ghani. Ashraf Ghani, in fact, had been an American Field Service exchange student in Lake Oswego, Oregon, in fact, when he was elected to the presidency in Afghanistan, he was an American citizen. He had to renounce his American citizenship to be able to run for president. 20 years go by in this long, difficult war. And during the Trump administration, the President Trump and his team decide that this war has gone on for too long and that we're going to figure out a way to extract ourselves. They take advantage of Zalmay Khalilzad, who he was also an American Field Service exchange student in the United States, in California. And they start to negotiate with the Taliban for the departure of the American and NATO troops and hopefully the sharing of power in Kabul between and among all the parties. As we all know from the newspapers, though, that didn't happen. When we pulled out and pulled our air cover out, importantly, then there was no more way that the Afghan National Army could defeat the Taliban. The Afghan National Army disappears and the Taliban take Kabul again without firing a shot, virtually. US troops leave, terrible chaos at the airport, as we all saw on the news, that difficult time in August of 2021. The loss of life was awful, and the refugee flow is just hard to imagine. This is inside the body of one of those large American transport planes, and there are 1,000 people on this plane, all sitting in there, and it's the height of COVID. And if you look at this closely, there isn't a mask in the group. If we had another hour or two, we'd look at these in some detail. We weren't ever sure what we were doing in Afghanistan. We certainly didn't understand how much an ancient culture and society it was when we came in with our very modern equipment. One of the American generals said that his job was like trying to put wheels on a camel. Wheels. As I mentioned, the Taliban in 2002 said, okay, well, you won. Now, how can we work this together? But the United States response was, we're still going to pay you back for allowing Al-Qaeda to operate from Afghanistan. There was vengeance is mine, saith the Americans. And we treated the Taliban just like we would treating Al-Qaeda. And the problem with that was that the Taliban was everywhere. The Taliban were Afghanistan. it is as though we didn't learn anything from our own experience in World War II. Yes, we tried and convicted and sometimes executed the German leadership and some of the Japanese leadership, but we didn't execute the school teachers in each of those countries. We incorporated them into this new thing called Germany or Japan. But in Afghanistan and in Iraq, we took the opposing side and we made them the enemy all the way down to the lowest of the low member. Invading Iraq was another thing that seemed to take our eye off the Afghan ball. Vengeance, as I said, with the Taliban. Failure to understand the country and the history and the culture is just what I told you about. The University of Washington failed to understand it, right? We didn't have a soul working on Afghanistan, and yet we were spending, in the end, so far, $2 trillion there. We have lost 2,500 men and women service members, almost 4,000 members of the contractor corps in this war, and untold numbers of Afghans. We also showed an extremely tolerant side of how we were going to run the show with the drug trade, fraud, corruption. One of the things about Hamid Karzai and Ashraf Ghani is that they were both very good English speakers, they were both snappy dressers, and they were both fabulously corrupt. Absolutely fabulously corrupt. And yet we put them there and then we worked through them with the rest. And how do you get the people, talk about hearts and minds, if the two leaders that we have installed are just milking the country dry of its resources? Pakistani intelligence next door was double dealing the whole time. There are lots of good books on your reading list about that. And I'll leave you with one quote, and I'm going to motor to it. Not this one, not that one, not this one, not that. Oh, that's too good. Yeah, this is too good. Yes, Eisenhower. But yes, huh? You want Eisenhower? Okay. So as you remember, President Eisenhower, in early 1961, just before he left office, he gave a farewell speech. And he said, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. We've all heard this speech a million times, that war is in fact profitable, and that there's a certain amount of inertia in the movement sense, not in the stopping sense, that if you have a war going, it continues to go. What most people don't know is that up to the sixth and final draft of this farewell address, Eisenhower had a different phrase for the military-industrial complex. And he was convinced at the end of this process not to use it because it was going to alienate too many people. But up into this number 5 draft, it read like this: the military-industrial congressional complex. Okay, our vital interests in Afghanistan, did we have them? Yes, I think you could say we did. We stopped the groups like Al-Qaeda operating in Afghanistan. They haven't attacked us since in that scale. And so we eliminated Al-Qaeda eventually from Afghanistan. And the other vital interest, some analysts have suggested, is that we wanted to safeguard all of those nuclear weapons that were right next door in Pakistan. And the only problem with this formula of these are our vital interests, they were all in Pakistan. Al-Qaeda was operating in Pakistan, right across that porous border, and the nuclear weapons were in Pakistan. So we're fighting a war in Afghanistan in the wrong place. And as we recall, it was Abbottabad where Osama bin Laden was finally discovered. It wasn't just in Pakistan, it was way over in eastern Pakistan on the Indian border. So That's about Abbottabad, where Osama bin Laden was finally killed. And this is not a very high note to leave you on, but we're gonna motor ahead to our uplifting benediction. The head of the Pakistani ISI, the intelligence service in Pakistan, was a guy named Kayani, General Kayani. He had been also chief of the general staff in the army before he was in the intelligence service. And he said famously, after the United States left Afghanistan in August of 2021, he said, with the help of the Americans, we defeated the Soviets in Afghanistan. And with the help of the Americans, we defeated the Americans in Afghanistan. Double dealing was the name of the game. And importantly, a very wise Pakistani scholar who was their assistant foreign minister, deputy foreign minister, tells this story, that dealing with Pakistan was like Charlie Brown dealing with Lucy during the football season. And he said, Mu'aid is his name, Yunus Mu'aid, he said that he was telling this story to a Pakistani general, that there was this American cartoon strip where Charlie Brown would run up and try to kick the football, and of course Lucy would pull it away. And he was telling this story to a Pakistani general, and after listening politely, the Pakistani general said, "It must be hard for you being Lucy." No trust whatsoever between these two groups. So there are a lot of Afghans coming our way, and I'm going to do this, and I will not have done it well, but I'm going to do that. And hang on. And I'm going to go right to this. Surely I can. And this. And this. Oh, so hang on. Let's do some Q&A for 5-10 minutes if we can have that time, and then I'll do the benediction. Okay. What involuntary hand raising? Yes, sir.
What prompted the Soviets to invade?
They felt it's a great question, because you sort of need to understand a lot about the Russian Empire before it was the Soviet Union, had absorbed all of those Muslim nations to the east of them. We know them as the Stans: Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan is the fifth one. And they're full of Muslims, right? And there was a concern that the Islamic fundamentalism that was bubbling up under these puppets that they had put in charge of the Afghan government were going to bubble up from the south and start to infect the soft underbelly of the Soviet Union. And so they said, we've got to stop it at the Amu Darya River and keep it south of us. And that's what led them to invade. Good question. Yes, Chris.
I'm curious about the Doha Agreement in May of 2020. My understanding was that Trump and company managed to get the Taliban leader out of a Pakistani prison and then did a deal with him. Now, I don't know if I'm understanding this right, but then at that point, we basically weren't working with the Afghani government because they weren't included in that. So what did we expect?
Yeah.
This question is about, you can tell, this question is
Oh,
about.
this question is about, and I should have done this earlier. That earlier question was about what caused the Soviets to invade, for the people on Zoom. This question is, let's talk about the negotiations in Doha, the capital of Qatar, between the Americans and the Taliban. And guess who wasn't at the table? The Afghan government that we said was sovereign and has to be respected. And we didn't include them, mostly because the Taliban didn't want to talk to them. They didn't consider them to be a legitimate government.
And we went along with it.
And we went along with it because what did we want to do when President Trump and Khalilzad, we wanted to get out of there so bad that we didn't mind how much of a mess we might have left behind. But, you know, we wanted to get out of there so bad in 1989, 90, we did almost exactly the same thing and didn't learn the lesson. And not only did we agree to a date certain when the United States would leave and all of its NATO allies, but we also said that we would strong arm the Kabul government into releasing 5,000 political prisoners, one of whom was the head of the Taliban, who has died, but then they have regrouped because all of those 5,000 were religious zealots that wanted to control the country. Yeah, that was a good question too. Yes, ma'am.
We've been talking about half the population of Afghanistan.
Yeah,
And I'm interested in the
other half. Yeah,
the women.
the women. What about the women in Afghanistan? Yeah,
Now,
Yeah.
what have they played in how
Yeah.
has this happened that
Yeah.
women are?
in 2020, the 21st century, how could there be a country that treats women the way they do? It too is a very, yes, I sure can. It's a great question. Part of it I've mentioned in brief and in passing about the patriarchy.
Yeah.
The patriarchy is alive and well in Afghanistan, particularly in the rural settings, 80% of the population lives in. And there's a saying in Afghanistan that a woman leaves the house twice, once to be married and once to be buried. And you may have noticed in this tragic series of earthquakes that have befallen Afghanistan over the last 4 or 5 months, almost all the dead are women, because the women are in those mud brick houses because there is no place for them outside in society. And so that's a huge tragedy, but it's one of the reasons why no government in the world yet, at least, recognizes the Taliban. Nobody does. They are still the only unrecognized country on the planet. Yeah, nobody. One of the tragedies of the last 20 years, since 2001, when we first invaded, was that we brought a whole generation of young people up to a level of expectation and training and awareness of the rest of the world that then gets dashed when we pull out and the Taliban take over again. And that generation, all those young people that are in that youth bubble, that's got to be one of the real crimes of this whole misbegotten enterprise, that we, in many instances, have abandoned those girls and women to just a horrific fate. Yeah, it's a good question. I wish I had a better answer.
I have one question also. You showed all those little circles, oblongs. You just said it's not a whole country, but it's just these little oblongs all over the world. But how can anybody govern that?
Yeah, no, that's right. Nobody can. Where empires go to die, the graveyard of empires, because they tried to control that territory too, and they couldn't do it. In fact, nobody could do it, except those little self-contained almost warlord ships that are all over those mountains, those vast mountain peaks. Yeah, two more. Yes, sir.
I have a question. I lived in Afghanistan and have strong connections with the country, and I also have extremely unorthodox perspectives. So this was a good textbook, academic, politically correct presentation from a historical perspective. But have you any experience or have you spoken about the spiritual side of Afghanistan, why it is a sacred place, what it has brought to humanity from the spiritual level, and why we should understand and know about that. You know, so I'll just ask that question.
Yeah, it's fabulous question, and it reflects a couple, three things. One of them is that I don't have much expertise in that side of Afghan history, culture. I know quite a bit about Islam, but I don't know much about how Islam is practiced in Afghanistan. The second point is that it's a little abstract for a slideshow presentation to be able to see if you can convey the sort of deeply spiritual, theosophical aspects of Afghanistan. So maybe that technical difficulty just bested me, even if I did know something about it. And the third is we only had an hour. But I would encourage Enlighten to invite you to give the second one.
It can be done. I've done it, and I would love to do it because I tell the story 99% of the world doesn't have a clue.
Yeah.
And Enlighten was founded though with, we hope we have discussion afterwards. So I hope you stay around and people can have a further discussion.
Yeah, thank you. One more involuntary hand raising.
What
So-
do you expect us to do now?
Aha. So it's funny you should ask, Jill, because it would be great if you had an extra $5 to send it to one of these agencies that's trying to figure out how to resettle. There are more than 2,000 Afghan refugees in the state of Washington now that have arrived since August of 20. Jose, I'm so glad you're here. Yeah. So as you can see from this list, many of these are faith-based organizations, and they're doing the Lord's work, as it were. They're figuring out ways of taking these people who have left everything at home, gotten on that airplane if they were lucky, and gotten into the state of Washington where they need virtually everything. So if you have a $5 or $10 to contribute, you all speak English. So they all need English language training, even if you did it on Zoom. They all might need this extra silverware that you haven't used because you've got 4 sets of it from Great Aunt Martha, and you don't need it anymore. Find somebody in these organizations that can distribute it to a family that needs forks and knives. So I give you that list. It's also on your salmon sheet here. And that would be a wonderful way to stay involved and contribute. My wife has been tutoring 7 and a 9-year-old Afghan kids in Kent, but she's been doing it throughout COVID on Zoom. And they're just the most adorable kids you ever saw in your life. And they mostly, for the hour they spend twice a week, they mostly all, including my wife, giggle. Yeah, they're just having so much fun sort of discovering this new country. But let me leave you with a benediction that does have a spiritual component to it from a mountain kingdom not far from Afghanistan, in fact, contiguous to it, Tibet. The Dalai Lama has famously said this: choose to be optimistic. It feels better. Yeah. And with that, I want to thank you all for having me out to Bremerton tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. And he'll be around for a little bit afterwards. You can talk to him privately, and we can talk to this other gentleman too, and amongst yourselves.